Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Here. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is June 5th, 2019. We have a new variety of things not appearing to work. Hopefully, I'm going out. I really have no idea at this point in time. I think so. We'll see. Anyway, on with the show. Tonight, the Canadian Journalism Support Fund. The $600 million street fight is heating up. Just in case you haven't heard, traditional media in Canada has fallen on hard times. Just ask them. Coverage on this topic by corporate print, periodical, radio, and television has not been sporadic or lacking detail. But it's not like this is an overnight avalanche without a clear pattern developing over the past 30 years. The once exclusive domain of print for classified ads, which generated a huge portion of revenues, started to disappear with eBay, Kijiji, Craigslist, and others near the turn of the century. It's been replaced by nothing. A high market saturation of subscriptions to print started to decay more than a generation ago. It has been replaced by nothing. The speed and agility of the internet is no competition for hard copy physical text in delivery or in currency. That was countered by creating a new delivery system by entities with no digital experience. News aggregators simply took it and ran, also taking almost all the revenue from the activity. TV thought the video format would insulate their ad revenues. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and others said not so fast. These lost revenues have been replaced by nothing. Only radio has managed to keep afloat, but not anything more than that. So everybody knows the problem. It's been almost 50 years since the Davey report in the Canadian Senate titled The Uncertain Mirror, and it sounded the alarm on the then new issue of media concentration. Today, Google and Facebook take 2/3 of all advertising revenues in media. That's concentration. Canadians still trust and value their traditional media by a large margin compared to the internet giants playing the news game today. In 2017, the Public Policy Forum undertook a new study to guide government on how to go about trying to rescue legacy media in Canada. It's called the Shattered Mirror. Now, the money has been earmarked, nearly $600 million of it. But now the hard part begins. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about this report by the Public Policy Forum, The Shattered Mirror. there's been kind of the presentation or the assumption that this entire media rescue thing is almost by the seat of the pants. It's like, holy shit, we got to do something. Well, it's not the case. In 2016, this was already an issue for the federal government. This study by the PPF is in 2017. We're not hearing a lot about what the future is, how this money is going to be decided, how it's going to be sold to the public, tax credits, grants, who's eligible, who's not. This has not been done before. So there's really not a lot of anything concrete to go on when you look forward. But when you look back to why they decided to start this program, you learn a hell of a lot more than waiting for the same people who are hoping to get some of this money tell you what's going on. Anybody who's interested in this topic, ppforum.ca is where you can get the Shattered Mirror in its entirety. No, that's not true. Sorry. Shatteredmirror.ca is a direct download site for the report. Now, what is it? Well, the Shattered Mirror is the first major study of the state of the news media in Canada since milestone reports by Senator Keith Davey and Tom Kent in the 70s and 80s, respectively, as well as a Senate report in 2006, all of which were concerned about the concentration of ownership and its dangers. Now, this PPF report looks at the state of a much weaker news media in a very different environment, severely disrupted by the digital age. It is a forward-looking report making 12 bold and specific recommendations that address two broad key questions. Does the news media, and particularly the civic function of journalism, the coverage of public institutions, public affairs, and communities, need support? If so, how can we ensure it does not lock in privilege and stifle innovation? And how can accountability and commonwealth be safeguarded without compromising the independence of the media? Two very good questions. It took them about, around 90 pages to come to this conclusion. And when you read this report, you find out how different Canada really is from the United States. It's nice to see, in my opinion, and it's one of the differences between citizens of the two countries, but this really demonstrates it. And when you look at current media coverage about the Journalism Support Fund, whatever it's called, it's very iffy. It has the overtone of what's going on? Nobody understands what's happening. Well, as I'm going to try and demonstrate using the Shattered Mirror, this is a very complex issue. And Canada, and the way it is a part of that. In a land of bubblegum forests and lollipop trees, every man would have his own newspaper or broadcasting station devoted exclusively to programming that man's opinions and perceptions. That is a quote from the Davey report, The Uncertain Mirror, in 1970. There was no digital, there was no anything. There was, no cable back then. But already, they could see what was coming. Now, this is the opening from the Shattered Mirror. Subtitle is News, Democracy, and Trust in the Digital Age. When Senator Davey made that fanciful remark in his landmark report on the state of the mass media in this country, Senator Davey was being facetious, not prophetic. He and his special Senate committee were agitated by what they considered the ill effects of concentrated media ownership on Canadian society. Proprietors of newspaper chains, they argued, were making fat profits, but the mirror they held up to the communities in which they operated were inadequate. Their report lamented, as did the Kent Commission in 1981 and the Senate report in 2006, that because the media rested in fewer and fewer hands, the quality of Canadian journalism and the health of our democracy were being compromised. In the decades since Senator Davey declared the media mirror uncertain, it is cracked and now appears shattered. The odd blend of content fragmentation, revenue consolidation, and indifference to truth has overtaken simple concentration of ownership as the main threat to holding public officials to account and reflecting Canadian society back to its citizens. The Internet, whose fresh and diverse tributaries of information made it a historic force for openness, now have been polluted by the runoff of lies, hate, and the manipulation of foreign powers. The truth neutrality of the dominant digital platforms is incompatible with democracy. Meanwhile, much of the traditional media is hurtling towards an unhappy date with destiny, and digital-only competitors remain journalistically underdeveloped. Today we deal with a reality almost unimaginable back in 1970. The far-fetched bubblegum and lollipops option has come to pass. Every man and woman can now literally communicate his or her opinions and perceptions. Blogs, social media feeds, podcasts, and smartphones give citizens unprecedented voice and sometimes place them at the scene of placing them at the scene of breaking news that in an earlier time would have gone unreported. To lean in and engage publicly or lean back and consume passively is a choice that now rests with individual citizens, not just media companies. The digital revolution is made for a more open and diverse news ecosystem and a meaner and less trustworthy one. It has also upended the model of journalistic boots on the ground, backed up by a second platoon in the office upholding such hallowed standards as verification and balance. Established news organizations have been left gasping, while native digital alternatives have failed to develop journalistic mass, especially in local news. The financial degradation has been insidiously incremental, but one whose accumulation and now acceleration has brought to the fore the issue of sustainability of news gathering in our democracy. Do the media, and particularly the civic function of journalism, the coverage of public institutions, public affairs, and community, need a lifeline? If so, how can we ensure it does not lock in privilege, stifle innovation, and weaken democracy itself? And can accountability and commonwealth continue to exist without compromising the media's essential independence? Imagine for a moment a community without news, how atomized and dysfunctional it would be. In 2009, the Knight Commission on the Information Needs of Communities in a Democracy, a blue ribbon panel of U.S. media, policy, and civic leaders, concluded that news is as vital to democracy as clean air, safe streets, good schools, and public health. There have been nothing but studies like this around the world over the last few years. The disruption of news media has been taking place for a long time, but it has risen to an entirely new plane with the shockingly sudden consolidation in unseen hands of both internet ad revenues and control of who sees what among the thousands of competing political and social narratives. the loser is not just the incumbent news media, whose models and management have struggled to adapt. The question now before Canadian policymakers is whether democracy itself is being put at risk. As the audience of the FCC study observed, information goods are public goods. The failure to provide them is, in part, a market failure. But carefully crafted public policy can address the gaps. In 2014, a report commissioned by the Dutch government found that the new media order looked incapable under most scenarios of providing broad layers within society with reliable and completely factual and relevant information. Now, when the PPF began thinking about a study on the state of the news media in Canada in early 2016, the headlines were all bad. Within a fortnight, in January 2016 alone, Rogers Media and Post Media announced new rounds of staff reductions. Torstar revealed plans to close its printing plant, and Confederation-era newspaper titles in Guelph, Ontario, and Nanaimo, BC, were shuttered. The first of 6 daily papers to close, merge, or reduce their publishing schedules before the end of 2016. Situation wasn't much better on the broadcast news side, where revenues, especially in local television, followed the downward track of the newspaper industry. A parliamentary committee was formed. News companies and industry associations queued up with complaints of inequities in the marketplace. Some made requests for public assistance. The Government of Canada contracted with the Public Policy Forum, a nonpartisan and independent think tank, to assess the situation and make recommendations on what, if anything, should be done. The object was not to defend any mode of news delivery, but to evaluate the risk to democracy. Funny how you don't hear that part about the risk to democracy being mentioned by any of the corporate media when they talk about this funding. Isn't that interesting? People might pay too much attention then. That won't work out well for us. Well, whatever. Now, there were 3 questions that PPF drafted to make this study. Number 1, does the deteriorating state of traditional media, particularly but not exclusively newspapers, put at risk the civic function of journalism and media, and therefore the health of our democracy? Number 2, if so, are new forms of digitally based media and communications filling the gap, or can they reasonably be expected to do so after a transition period? And number 3, if no, what is the role for public policy in ensuring the healthy flow of news of information deemed vital to our democracy, and what are the least intrusive and most efficient ways of designing and delivering these policies? The 4th question became apparent very soon after. Were algorithms that were intended to tailor online information to individual preferences, instead segregating people in filter bubbles and thereby eroding a sense of commonwealth? By the time of the U.S. election in November, filter bubbles and fake news had moved from the sidelines to center stage as a democratic concern. Supports for periodicals and minority language publications also flow from public policy. The first postal subsidy in Canada predates Confederation. Foreign ownership restrictions are a policy. The Ontario Media Development Corporation's tax credit for digital media innovation, radically altered for fiscal reasons in 2015, is a government policy. Several provinces have chosen to exempt newspaper subscriptions from provincial sales tax. Well, any case for rescuing the media must be utterly compelling and delicately designed to safeguard press freedom, it's important to remember that Canada has always pursued public policy to ensure there is journalism by Canadians for Canadians. The CBC is an instrument of public policy. So is the CRTC. So is Section 19 of the Income Tax Act, introduced in 1965 to assist Canadian-owned media in the competition for advertising revenue. Section 19 is not currently applied to internet platforms. A large issue. Break for a second. Much of this policy was created for a pre-digital age, and in places it is perversely unfair. There is no excuse for the fact that Canadian companies producing journalism are saddled with tax disadvantages in selling advertising or subscriptions. Governments in some other countries have responded more quickly with initiatives to level the tax and copyright playing fields. First in France, and then in the EU as a whole, digital innovation funds were established after negotiations with Google. Germany is considering legislation to hold Facebook to account for fake news that appeared in its social feeds and then goes uncorrected. Now remember, this is written in 2017. Still, we are also seized by concern over editorial independence, as were respondents in our public opinion research. Indeed, Canadians believe so strongly in journalism and its role in keeping the powerful honest that many find the mere notion of government support to be at odds with the very purpose of the news media. When we asked participants in focus groups to reconcile these misgivings with the mounting loss of journalists, they often fell silent. So, this is an issue that differs right away from the United States. This is a big study. This is a well-done study. And it's saying that the majority of Canadians felt that any government money was not a good sign. But how do you stop the industry from disappearing? Nobody had any answers. Before deciding what can and should be done, it is crucial to determine whether and to what extent a crisis truly exists. There is much talk that the demand for news has disappeared, but our inquiries suggest that Canadians still seek to be informed, although at the time of their choosing and with little or no cost to themselves. New technologies have not only made this possible, but increased the supply of news and opinion dramatically. They have also allowed for the bifurcation of production and distribution, with financial returns heavily skewed to the latter, distribution. Moreover, the Internet, once an extraordinary manifestation of freewheeling information market, has quickly come to be dominated by a pair of global giants from Silicon Valley, Google and Facebook, that are not only lacking in passion for news, but actively avoiding the responsibilities of a publisher. To some extent, the increased supply may be an illusion created by the same news being replicated in many locations. If so, such repetition constitutes a net good, in that it creates more opportunities for citizens to encounter information of civic importance. But the critical issue for policy purposes is where it originates, not how and where it is accessed. The vaunted media ecosystem ceases to deliver on its democratic role without this wellspring of original news, especially the variety we call civic function news. Now, of course, they expand that definition a bit here, say coverage of elected officials and public institutions such as legislatures, judicial and quasi-judicial bodies, city halls, school boards, and supporting public services, issues, and debates related to these officials and bodies, and the ability of communities to know about themselves for civic purposes. No, I don't think anybody could disagree with that. Whether it's happening or not is another question. Public policy should hold no interest in who produces this news, whether a nightly television network, a newspaper born in the 19th century, an independent journalist, or a digital startup. Only that it exists. As stated, the focus of this report is unremittingly on the role news plays within a democracy and the critical question of whether the transition from one model of journalism to another poses an acceptable risk. For many in and around the media, it's a given that journalism resides at the heart of civic function news. In mandate letters to Cabinet, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau instructed every minister to be respectful of journalists, as they are professionals who, by asking the necessary questions, contribute in an important way to the democratic process. In launching the second phase of consultations on Canadian content in a digital age, the Department of Canadian Heritage said one of its goals was to ensure that Canadians have an opportunity to actively participate in our democracy by having access to high-quality news information and local content that reflects a diversity of voices and perspectives. The PPF, however, came at this assumption with what we hope was an open mind, poking and prodding it before concluding that professional journalism has been enriched but not replaced by an infusion of non-professional participants in the new media ecosystem. Hopefully that's where I come in. Late in our research phase, the spigot of bad news for the industry opened even wider. As a diagnosis that opens this report shows, the news media's march for the precipice appears to be picking up speed. This slide may not produce the kind of crisis point that stops policymakers in their tracks, as the implosion of the auto industry in 2008-2009 did, but the pace is unrelenting and the downward slope even steeper. In September of 2017, Rogers Media announced it would dial back the publication schedule of its consumer magazines, including Maclean's, an iconic news brand for more than a century. Well, I just talked about the cuts in 2017 there. Of course, since then, Rogers has sold Maclean's and all of their periodicals. Despite aggressive cost-cutting and a summertime restructuring of its debt, Post Media reported a loss on the year of $352 million, based on declines of 21.3% in print advertising and 8% in print circulation. Digital revenues grew by a meager 0.8%. The company quickly began to institute a further 20% reduction in payroll, and a year that has already seen it combine the news-gathering operations of the tabloid Sun chain and its broadsheet newspapers. This latest journalistic carnage left the chain represented by a parliamentary bureau of 6 journalists, 3 reporters, and 3 columnists, compared with double that at the beginning of 2016 and more than 35 at the turn of the century, including at one point dedicated reporters for Montreal, Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, and Windsor. All this occurred against a backdrop of $2.3 million in bonuses paid to Post Media executives so they would remain with the company. What should not be lost is that when it comes to journalism, Canada is not the United States, at least not yet. Despite all the talk of a loss of faith in news media, our research and that of others suggests that Canadians still trust journalists and journalism. Journalists, media executives, academics, and policy analysts are all wrestling with what the waning status of traditional journalism truly means. Are we merely passing through a turbulent transition to a more open and diverse future, or witnessing something that could inflict lasting damage on democracy? What interventions are warranted if the new information marketplace proves to be a poor guardian of the public good, if not, in fact, antithetical to it? Can we afford to wait and find out? Like it or not, the forests are now made of bubblegum. There are lollipops on the trees, and the media's mirror is no longer uncertain or even merely cracked. It is within this context that we release The Shattered Mirror: News, Democracy, and Truth in the Digital Age. I think that's a pretty good opening statement for what you will find in this report. And they're very clear on their interpretation of some things, such as Canada is not the U.S. And, of course, that's another huge issue with eligibility of post-media or not. Eligibility for everybody, not just who gets in, who doesn't get in. Another huge issue, but that's what these panels are about, et cetera, et cetera. But going to get back to the report, The Shattered Mirror. Journalism extends far beyond the newspaper companies, but the newspaper as a package or bundle of information pieces established the commercial foundation for the news industry and served as the spine of daily journalism even after the arrival of television. In the early 1950s, there were more papers sold every day than the country had households. But by 1995, just as internet access began to become commercially available, household penetration dropped below 50%. So what had gone wrong? Is it not simply that new forms of information access, circulation, and retrieval have been added to the media ecosystem? Journalism's economic model has collapsed profoundly and structurally. One form of advertising, the classifieds, was the special preserve of the newspaper. The small change of commercial transactions, vital to the life of any community, but extremely lucrative in total sum. Well into the late 1990s, anyone looking to rent an apartment, sell a sofa, or post a death notice had almost no option but the local daily. Broadcasters and magazines simply could not accommodate either the volume of classified listings or the daily turnover. And yet, as early as 1964, Marshall McLuhan observed, "The classified ads and stock market quotations are the bedrock of the press. Should an alternative source of easy access to such diverse daily information be found, the press will fold." Good old McLuhan. That alternative arrived in 1995, the very year the Canadian newspaper household penetration dropped below 50%. San Jose software developer Pierre Omidyar created a digital bazaar for the sale and purchase of precisely the sort of merchandise previously found only at flea markets or garage sales, and in the classifieds. That same year, Craig Newmark, another California software engineer, began to circulate an email list of upcoming social events and job openings to friends and fellow programmers. Today, Omidyar's eBay, Newmark's Craigslist, and a multitude of more specialized merchandising forums, as well as job markets and networking venues such as LinkedIn, have stripped the incumbent media of what was once their bread and butter. In doing so, they demolished the foundation on which the news industry was built. Between 2000 and 2008, classified advertising earned Canada's daily newspaper industry more than $800 million a year, reaching an historic high of $8.75 million in 2005, the year Kijiji started in Canada. A decade later, by 2015, that figure had dropped to 119 million, and the trend is towards zero. In 2006, display advertising, wrapped around the news and service sections, accounted for almost $1.8 billion in revenue for the daily newspaper industry. By 2015, that figure had dropped to 907 million, very nearly cut in half within a decade, and still going down by double-digit percentages every year. Now, initially, the Canadian newspaper industry managed to slow its march to the precipice by raising subscription prices after years of undercharging readers for its product. But that has not proved to be a long-term solution. 5 straight years of shrinkage have eliminated $150 million in total circulation revenue. All told, from 2006 to 2015, Canadian daily newspapers lost 40% of their revenues. The pace has accelerated over the past 3 years, and their total income was on track to fall below $2 billion in 2016, down from $3.3 billion a decade earlier. Broadcasting has also been disrupted by the internet and what it has made possible, from YouTube to Netflix to online streaming. Television viewership for news remains strong, but the audience is older and therefore of diminishing interest to advertisers. The all-news channels rely on in-studio panels of guests to supplement their basic reporting with an abundance of opinion and argument. Smaller and fewer TV news crews are expected to fill more and more airtime, plus feed digital platforms, meaning they have less and less real time to devote to research and the cultivating of sources. The same, of course, is true for print reporters, who have multiple mouths to feed: the website, video, social media, the app, and the paper. Because feature writing, beat reporting, and investigations are now rarer, the news agenda today is more highly skewed to crime, natural disasters, and institutional stories driven by press releases and press conferences. The daily picture of our local and national life provided by Canada's news media is already less complete, less nuanced, less authentic, more sensational, more staged, and more negative. As the business crisis worsens, the news media's representation of Canada becomes less reflective of our collective reality. That is a quote from John Cruikshank, a former head of CBC News and a former publisher of the Toronto Star. Canada's traditional news organizations have an additional problem. They have lost control over the distribution of their products. More and more, their stories are accessed not from their own websites, but through aggregators such as Google News, National News Watch, or Facebook, Twitter, or other social media venues. The source of news content becomes opaque. Just as television viewers barely notice the names of the production companies that produce programming, Facebook and Google users pay scant attention to where their news content originates. A 2016 report by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism found that news brands are clearly noticed by readers less than half the time on social media. News companies worry their identities are eroding as their journalistic output is channeled through other platforms and feel incapable of resistance. Drink break. As a leading Canadian media executive at one of the roundtables, there is no choice but to post on Facebook. That's where the audience is. The CBC's French and English news sites, Canada's most visited, attract 15 million people in a typical month. These are 2017 numbers, remember. Facebook says it has 17 million active users in Canada every day. Yet even as audiences shift and brand identity and allegiances erode, public opinion research conducted for this report found that at important decision-making junctures, citizens invest their trust in established news brands, look to them, and count on them. They just don't want to pay for them. It would be a mistake to romanticize the traditional news industry. It has consistently been the object of pointed, often infuriated criticism. For all that they claim to fulfill an essential democratic function, there has been a persistent worry that the pressures of the market and the tastes of the public subvert the social responsibilities of the news media and their commitment to the public good. What democracy requires is sober attention to political authority. What the public prefers on normal days is clickbait, sensationalism, scandal, sentimentality, and novelty. What media proprietors prioritize are profit margins and returns on investment. Critics on the right therefore see the news media as biased, irresponsible, and hysterical, either inflaming and cheapening public discourse or treating certain viewpoints with utter disregard. Critics on the left see them as agents of the very power structure they are supposed to be monitoring, the ideological state apparatus. Centrists worry that the media's civic mission is too often sacrificed to satisfy corporate ledgers. When the news media dominated public discourse, that dominance was cause for concern. Fear of concentration of ownership led to the 1970 Special Committee of the Senate on Mass Media, the 1981 Kent Commission, and the 2006 Senate Report on the Canadian news media, all of which bemoaned the fact that corporate control restricted journalism's diversity of perspective and expression, limited the agenda of concern, and reduced investment in news gathering in order to maximize profits. The failing fortunes of the traditional news media are not just the result of an older medium faring poorly against a new competitor. The arrival of radio and television altered the media ecosystem and changed advertising practices, but they were, like newspapers, media of mass communication. Content addressed vast, dispersed, and otherwise atomized audiences. The advent of computer-mediated networks of social communications is of a different order entirely. It amounts to a profound structural change. Under the old regime, the media were agencies of public address. They spoke to audiences whose members had little opportunity to speak back and even less to speak among themselves. Once the perfect amalgam of news, service journalism, opinion, and advertising, in the space of a decade, the news industry's distinctive cultural attributes and market advantages have been taken from it. No longer necessary or even relevant as a vehicle for surface journalism, a forum for debate, or an advertising vehicle, what are the news media left with? What do they offer that is not available elsewhere? They are left with the news, the dutiful record of unfolding events, a perishable commodity, out of date as soon as it's published. News must be produced continuously. And while what some is of national and international significance, most is inherently parochial of interest only for circumscribed geographical pockets, and therefore difficult, if not impossible, to scale in order to sell to wider and larger markets. Even when the media companies were at their most profitable, the news, particularly that devoted to civics, was a loss leader, rarely generating sufficient revenue on its own to cover the cost of production. Now it is not simply that the business model of the news industry is broken. as though if they could only find new ways of re-engaging their audiences, the incumbent media companies might return to 20th century levels of profitability. What is broken beyond repair is a centuries-old arrangement that wed a certain type of editorial content to a certain type of commercial messaging. Its replacement is an ecosystem of social communication. The new digital concourses not only allow people to converse, collaborate, and clash with one another, they profit from these activities. Online actions and interactions enable the harvesting of data on individual and group preferences, behavior, and purchasing patterns. Information that can be used to market everything from content to retail goods to lattice works of connected individuals. People are revealed through their digital activity. They have all but come to constitute themselves by it. And the knowledge of those transactions is the commercial basis for the new communication empires. Neither traditional news media nor a bevy of city-based or national digital upstarts have the capacities to interact with audiences in the way of search engines and social media networks, and thereby collect motherloads of data of deep interest to marketers. Google and Facebook, the innovative and libertarian-minded colossi of online interactivity, have used their technical prowess to accumulate unprecedented power over distribution of the web's content fragments, including news. Digital ad revenue in the United States grew by $2.7 billion in the first quarter of 2016 alone, compared with a year earlier. Of that, $1.4 billion went to Google, $1 billion to Facebook, and just $300 million of that increase year to year, only $300 million went to everybody else. At this point, the pair account for about 70% of the total U.S. market and command 90% of incremental growth. That right there is very important. Not only are they continue to grow, all new growth, 90% of incremental growth is claimed by them. The pattern is the same in Canada. They pocket 2 of every 3 digital ad dollars spent in Canada and, in recent months, have generated 82.4% of the ads served up with digital news. In 2016, Canadian publishers accounted for just 11.5% of the digital display ad market in their home country. That's a problem. The agnosticism Facebook and Google exhibit towards the content they carry represents a new challenge, both for the news industry and for society at large. The new ecosystem still prizes attention above all. That is the metric by which advertising revenue is apportioned. But under the old regime, news companies invested in the reliability of their coverage and worked to prevent false, hateful, and deliberately manipulative content from entering circulation. The new regime, which has traded a mass market for hundreds of millions of tiny markets, has no such compunction. It is cheap, easy, and profitable for clickbait factories to fabricate content that will arrest attention purely for commercial gain. And it is just as cheap and easy for political provocateurs to manufacture disinformation designed to discredit their ideological opponents. Therefore, genuine journalism must now compete with content that mimics it and dresses deceit in a cloak of credibility, while society must adapt to a world in which fact and falsehood are increasingly difficult to tell apart. An information market polluted this way puts the very notion of credibility at risk. Even as the battle over credibility takes shape, the authority of traditional news organizations is dissipating. Much of that authority derived from their capacity to dictate a news agenda They establish what were commonly accepted as matters of public concern. Weakened, they create greater space for fake news to gain a foothold. And the economic bias of the internet against the local and toward the global, the opposite of the newspaper world, is having an impact. 5 of the 10 newspaper sites now visited most often by Canadians are not Canadian. All this means that the Commonwealth's shared sense of community and purpose among citizens is challenged as global and libertarian values gain ground. In a world of limitless expression and Facebook filters, there is no longer a common chronicle of current events. Mysterious automated algorithms informed by people's own information consumption habits and those of their concentric circles of quote-unquote friends mean that everyone's news agenda is personalized. Perceptions of the unfolding present are individual constructs, articulations of particular interests, 1.8 billion unique feeds. As you see, this report doesn't just focus on how do we spend $600 million. As they said, they are looking at this for how it affects democracy. Just looking at the time. Well, we'll see. We'll keep going for this for now because I do have most of the follow-up for what's been publicly said and how the press has reacted to it. And, of course, like anything else, there's some excellent disinformation coming from certain parties on this topic, but we'll get to that. Another model, or supposed model, trotted out regularly is salvation via a wealthy white knight. Several have appeared south of the border. Mexican oil magnate Carlos Slim has helped bankroll the New York Times. Boston Red Sox and Liverpool FC owner John Henry, who made his fortune as a hedge fund investor, now owns the Boston Globe. And Amazon founder Jeff Bezos has been working his digital marketing magic with the Washington Post, which says it turned a profit in 2016. Of course, not all billionaires are benevolent. Gambling magnate Sheldon Adelson bought Nevada's largest newspaper, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and used it to hound his enemies. Warren Buffett, who just 4 years ago predicted a big comeback for the local press, told Politico in 2016, local newspapers continue to decline at a very significant rate. And even with the economy improving, circulation goes down, advertising goes down, and it goes down in prosperous cities. It goes down in areas that are having urban troubles. It goes down in small towns. That's what amazes me. A town of 10 or 20,000, where there's no local TV station, obviously, and really there's nothing on the internet that tells you what's going on in a town like that, but the circulation just goes down every month. Even if there were enough such saviors, and they strive not to act in their own interest, a society in which reporting the news depended on the whims of the super rich would be a precarious place. In any case, Canada is less than replete with billionaires, and 3 of the wealthiest families, Thompson, Desmarais, and Irving, have been in the business for decades. Toronto investor Prem Vatsa, who has lost money on past forays into CanWest and Torstar, is once again on the prowl, increasing his stake in Torstar to 27% in 2016. What Canada does have is a history of public intervention to compensate for being a small market contiguous with the United States. Today, the country is enriched by cultural production in music, publishing, independent film and television, spheres of creativity, investment opportunity, and employment that would not exist except for policy measures employed to bring them about. Then there is public broadcasting, The CBC and Radio-Canada, along with TV Ontario and TFO, Télé-Québec, and BC's Knowledge Network. These are not arms of the government answerable to the dictates of politicians. Rather, crown corporations created to compensate for a media market otherwise shaped by and indebted to advertising. They exist to provide programming the private sector either cannot or will not provide because there is no profit in it. Although the private sector will argue that this principle has repeatedly been abrogated by the CBC, shaped by a commercial history. Canada, like other nations, is facing a series of paradoxes. The sheer volume of information now available, the variety of sources, and the range of perspectives they express far outstrip what traditional news media could ever put into circulation. And yet what were once routine subjects for coverage begin to disappear from the information diet simply because to report on them diligently is no longer profitable. The promise of democracy, that the people should have the means to voice their opinions on political affairs, has been fulfilled with a vengeance, just at a moment when conscientious media attention to government has been compromised. The incumbent news media are weighed down by both their cost structures and cultures of speaking at the public, which is instead expecting cybernetic engines of interconnection. The new media, trying to come of age in Canada, are more comfortable in the looser clothing of communications preferred by millennials, but have yet to acquire the critical mass to shape shared knowledge and move public opinion. We stand at a junction where the traditional economic base of the news media has crumbled, and the technologically ascendant cannot be allowed to recede into clickbait and falsehood, or fail to muster the resources to speak to at least most of the people a good portion of the time. We don't have much choice in this, is what they're saying. I mean, they've already come to the assumption that, yes, print media is going to die. There's no way around that. It is going to die. And again, because of the different perspective they're taking here, what will remain be prepared for a suitable role when that happens? Canada has been contriving for generations to provide its citizens with common pools of information through public policy initiatives. From the creation of the CBC, to the addition of Section 19 to the Income Tax Act, to the Canada Periodical Fund, these are designed to counter an economic logic that has favored the importation of information from large media entities to the south. With the diminution of established media, an explosion of new entrants, and the rise of social media, comes an abundance of paradoxes. There is more choice and yet less information about civic affairs, from city halls and school boards to courts and legislatures. Audiences are fragmented while digital revenues have become concentrated in a pair of Silicon Valley-based global giants for whom news is an add-on. Once strong and free, Canada's news industry finds it even harder to finance the creation of original news, an affliction of both the so-called legacy media as well as the sprinkling of Canadian digital news startups. To be free, the press must be financially viable. Someone needs to finance the news, whether consumers directly, advertisers trying to reach audiences, benevolent or otherwise billionaires, financial data companies looking to round out their offerings, philanthropists, venture capitalists, governments, someone. The extraordinary financial strain on the journalistic system Canadians have known for a century has led to successive waves of newsroom buyouts and layoffs. As the mirror the media holds up to society shatters, a disruptive news system is rising in its place. Although more diverse and participatory, it either lacks investment capital or has yet to prove that it can deliver a reliable flow of civic function news. We're certainly witnessing a crisis for the traditional news industry, but is it a crisis for democracy? There are now entirely new concourses of communication, new genres of information and entertainment, new avenues of social interaction, and new ways to marshal scrutiny of public affairs. How societies inform themselves is undergoing a seismic shift. Like the printing press 500 years ago, the only true comparison, the internet creates unprecedented opportunity for those outside the elites to elbow their way into civic discourse. Today, anyone can contribute. Participation is no longer limited to those who find employment with newspapers and broadcasters. Just as the printing press served as the handmaiden to democracy, the internet has accorded freedom another great leap forward. To the extent public policy has a role to play, it should be focused on maintaining the flow of information essential to a healthy society and ensuring the development of the digital arteries of the new information system, not preserving the press as we know it. The digital revolution is real, but with it challenges have arisen. Fragmentation, distortion, and adjusting to new business and storytelling models. Democracy does not consist purely of a franchise exercised periodically at the ballot box. More broadly, it exists in the highest documentation of civic affairs and the unbridled welter of public opinion. Democracy is one great, ceaseless, fractious argument about where a society's priorities should be. Anti-democratic behavior occurs when people or groups of people are excluded from this conversation. Sometimes this conversation will become banal, irrelevant, or sensational. Periodically, it will be way off the mark. On other occasions, it will hit the bullseye. Certainly, the irritant of an overblown story is nothing in a democracy compared with the tragedy of stories about abuses of power that go untold. Albert Camus once was quoted as saying, "A free press can, of course, be good or bad, but most certainly, without freedom, the press will never be anything but bad." Independence of the news media has long been accepted as a fixture of a healthy democracy. Such a view is strongly embraced in public opinion research commissioned for this study. 8 out of 10 respondents said they actively follow the news. 70% said the news plays a major role in democracy, and another 17% said a minor role, versus just 5% who think it has no role at all. More than 3/4 said they believe democracy would be threatened if established news organizations were no longer able to fulfill their civic news function. According to our poll, Canadians place much more importance on politics, current affairs, and their communities when it comes to what constitutes news than on such categories as sports, entertainment, and celebrity. They see news as fundamental, even foundational, to democracy. In our focus groups, people describe the news in almost parental terms, as being not necessarily what you want to know at a given moment, but what you need to know. Others observed that without the news, they wouldn't be able to develop an opinion on public issues or stay informed, whether about what is happening far afield or close to home. It's not that they want to be engaged in the news or with news organizations every day. Most said they get much of their news from Facebook. It's simply that they don't want to rely on their friends when serious matters are at hand. They prefer a trusted source at these moments, often citing an established news brand or a particular journalist, such as a television anchor. That's interesting, I think. The propagation of untruths and spreading of hate online is expanding rapidly. It has always been axiomatic that the defense of free speech requires rallying around forms of speech that are unpopular. But the rise of a parallel media ecosystem that does not just tolerate hate, but privileges it, is an altogether different proposition in a democracy. Is there a point at which the defense of freedom erodes the cohesiveness of society? As new digital information initiatives emerge, as government and civic institutions adapt, and as democracy itself evolves, the question increasingly becomes, what is the essential place of public communication in the democratic wealth? Fake news is troubling, but this country is not without countervailing tools. However oxymoronic it may sound, in Canada, free speech is not an absolute. Here, hate, for instance, does not get a pass. Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms subjects rights as reasonable limits that can be demonstrably justified, and has been applied to both hate speech and obscenity. Anti-defamation and anti-bullying laws are other checks on free expression doing social harm. While Canadians like and live social media, they don't always hold it in high regard when the chips are down. They look to news media outlets and journalists who have been around a long time for substantiation of what they encounter online. They view them akin to first responders in an emergency. They're in reserve for when you need them and prepared to check things out on your behalf at the scene of the action. The public's vista of what may constitute a threat or democratic deficit extends well beyond elections. Attention to the workings of public institutions and the state of democratic rights, including a free press and independent judiciary, is also vital. This view is consistent with the Charter, which sets out an extensive series of rights beyond Section 3, guaranteeing voting for members of the House of Commons and legislative assemblies. Among those rights are freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association, mobility, legal, equality, official language, minority education, and Aboriginal rights. Journalism's job is to be vigilant on all fronts. Our polling shows Canadians worry about the following consequences from the decline of news organizations: a loss of investigative reporting, a loss of information with which to protect their rights, a loss of local reporting, a lessening of professionalism, and less accountability on the part of politicians and other powerful interests. Ultimately, the public is trapped between concerns about a world without reliable and ready news and concerns that actions to right the situation would corrupt the very purpose of journalism. Fully 75% say they worry that if money went to journalists, it would affect their impartiality. And 68% say the same for news organizations. Asked how they would reconcile a choice between no news and news with government support, our focus groups tended to fall silent. Ultimately, they hope the situation will fix itself. How Canadian. To repeat, Canadians are extremely leery of any measure, however well-intentioned, that gives the state a place in the newsrooms of the nation. Policies that might influence coverage are out of the question. News organizations and journalists are held in high esteem as guardians of democracy, so much so that there is little appetite for using taxpayers' dollars to prop up failing news corporations as they attempt to transition to a new environment. Canadians have not shut the door, but remain skeptical. Contriving to square this circle will require delicacy and creativity. I think when the Liberal government read that, they said, okay, we got our money's worth. Now you understand a little better, I hope, with some background and what Canadians are saying in this study, is this is an extremely hard sell, but if the sale is not made, media dies. That's it. That's the situation. You know, I mean, a country with the population of California and a landmass second in the world. That's a problem. It's not a traditional market. It's not a model market by any means. So, I mean, things are different here. But I am surprised reading this report that Canadians do trust their press as much as they still do compared to the United States. So what that tells me is I'm in a bubble on Twitter. As long as you're aware of it, that's what matters. You know, fuck bubbles. As the traditional news industry, still the trusted source for so much vital information, fights for survival, the question becomes, to what extent should public policy support the traditional system where news overwhelmingly originates or encourage the development of new entrants with less journalistic muscle? Or should we try to do both? Either way, the highly regarded U.S. investigative site ProPublica sums up the origination-distribution dichotomy in language with which we agree. The number and variety of publishing platforms are exploding in the internet age, but very few of these entities are engaged in original reporting. In short, we face a situation where sources of opinion are proliferating, but sources of facts on which those opinions are based are shrinking. The former phenomenon is almost certainly, on balance, a societal good. The latter is surely a societal problem. That is the question. How are we doing on time? Okay. The next part of the report has a subtitle of System A and System B, Understanding the New Media. For 2 decades, the transformation of the news industry has largely been viewed in terms of technology, digital versus print and broadcast. But now such thinking is beside the point. Everyone is digital, or had better be. Where differentiation now occurs is on the approach to the gathering and dissemination of news. Let's break today's media into 2 different systems, understanding, of course, they are more ends of a continuum than opposite poles. System A is curated, codified, and professionalized. Now, these System A organizations, most of them well established, seek to help people navigate the clutter and complexity of news with a product that has the added value of classic editorial functions, such as selection, choosing the stories that matter, and hierarchy, giving prominence to the ones editors feel matter most. To generate the necessary content, System A employs relatively large numbers of journalists who are trained at formal institutions and or by virtue of an acculturating career path through the newsroom itself. It sets standards they are expected to meet and surrounds them with professional support, from style books and codes of conduct to editorial oversight and legal expertise. Many of its journalists are specialists, or at least were until newsrooms contracted, focused on general areas of coverage, or more specific beats. This is because the best stories, the ones where intelligence of the journalist meets the world at large, rarely appear fully formed. They usually begin as a tiny spark that may have gone unnoticed had a reporter, like the cop on the beat, not invested the time and energy to gather the knowledge required to make sense of a situation or build a reputation and earn the trust of someone with something special to share. Having journalists with the institutional backing to grind away day after day at a promising lead is what lies at the heart of System A's historic contribution to civic function journalism. From the Washington Post and Watergate to the Boston Globe's Spotlight expose south of the border, to the Toronto Star and Maverick Mayor Rob Ford, to the Globe and Mail's sponsorship scandal revelations, to the public affairs show Enquête on predatory policing in small-town Quebec, stories of great public interest often come to light only because of System A's capacity to investigate. System A's strengths lie in the standards, training, professionalism, and support system. Its weaknesses are usually macro. It is elite-led, the domain of a handful of news organizations controlled by wealthy owners and managed by a generally self-made journalistic aristocracy, the so-called gatekeepers, who decide what is significant and what is not, and often resist dissent and the unfamiliar. Not only has System A's pretense to objectivity long been suspect, its vaunted capacity to influence has been on the wane for years. System B, instant, participatory, opinionated. System B, on the other hand, has a more ambivalent relationship to the role of information hunter-gatherer. From niche producers to specialty aggregators and ubiquitous platforms, journalists either are in short supply or don't exist at all. Rather than the question of where a story is going, the issue tends to be more how it is being received. System A editors will cut slack for a story they believe will grow. System B is more responsive to instant data and analytics as to whether it's being read, shared, favored, etc. It can adjust how a story is played to suit the audience or kill it off. The core differentiator of System A tends to be its focus on the acquisition of facts as the basis for news stories. System B, in its milder versions, either exhibits a close attachment to opinion or the blending of opinion and fact, a natural offshoot of the high costs associated with employing reporters to ferret out matters of public interest. Or in its more algorithmic mass appeal variations, it has been relatively indifferent to truth and falsehood. This nudges new media toward commentary over reportage, as opinions are cheaper to form than news is to report on. Traditional media, too, are trending in a similar direction, as their economic strength is siphoned and participation by reporters on social media platforms such as Twitter lowers their classic hesitancy, perhaps an affectation in the first place, about expressing views on matters they cover. Simply put, System B doesn't have enough reporters. This may be because small organizations in its orbit haven't mustered the revenues to allow the critical mass necessary for a newsroom with material impacts, or it may be that other organizations adhere to a low-labor, high algorithmic model. For those in the former category, their newness and low journalistic intensity can promote taking shortcuts. Either way, social media platforms have allowed for the near-instant emergence of mass movements. Perhaps System B's shining moment occurred in the summer of 2013, when an Oakland activist named Alicia Garza responded to the acquittal of the man who gunned down Black Florida teen Trayvon Martin by posting on Facebook, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter. Black lives matter." Soon the hashtag was born, giving rise to a movement that has come to resemble a digital age civil rights organization. Despite having no central command structure it has used the avenues of System B to mobilize and to reveal police abuse as well as to raise public consciousness of racial exclusion. Whether the open architecture of System B fueling a rapid online ascendance, it may have struggled to capture the attention of System A's gatekeepers. Which system is better? That can be debated endlessly, and the answer may not really matter, because ultimately the determining factor remains which of them is sustainable, or which of them, or combinations of them, should be sustained. Clearly there is a transition underway, and it moves in the direction of System B. The matter of public interest is how can the democratizing potential of System B be advanced alongside the professional standards and reporting power of System A. The traditional values and practices of incumbent media, System A, are being disrupted along with their business models by new technologies, weakened economics, and changing audience tastes. Very different values and practices, System B, are arising in non-journalistic audience aggregating organizations. In between, lower barriers to entry are resulting in an erosion of professional standards on one hand, and a greater diversity of voices on the other. As well, new journalistic values and practices, such as correcting facts in breaking news stories as they develop, rather than verifying before publication, are being introduced. Many incumbent and digital-only news organizations with journalism at their core reside toward the left and center of the diagram. The fake news controversy is forcing System B operations to reevaluate some of their values and practices. Throughout this report, this is the PPF speaking now, of course, we've embraced the preposition that a public policy response to the economic challenges of the news media is justified only to counter a risk to the health of our democracy. That is where the public interest lies. We began by examining whether faltering business models are impairing the ability of traditional media to deliver civic function journalism, and if so, whether new digital media or communications now fill that gap. Then came the explosion of news to mislead and confuse citizens, and its viral dissemination via the digital age tools of search and social media. By now, the term fake news is already losing meaning as it's applied to information that may simply be incorrect. Truly fake news is like counterfeit money. It has been manufactured for profit or to devalue political discourse. Either way, the juxtaposition of the upswing of illegitimate and inexpensive fake news and the downturn of legitimate and expensive real news brings added urgency to the issues at the core of this report. I'm not really going to read much. Let's see if I get time to get to their specific recommendations, because now I want to move to where the process is right now. That was the report that informed the federal government to a great deal. As I said, if you take the time to download the report and look at it yourself, it's a hell of a piece of work. There is a lot of information and evidentiary precedent for what the hell should be done. Doesn't really give answers, but it gives you background from A to Z. I'm going to go back to March of this year. The CTV, Terry Pedwell. Questions about who qualifies surround journalism supports in the federal budget. Concerns are being raised about limits to who might qualify for aid under a section of the federal budget geared towards supporting journalism. and whether the money will, in the long run, save a sector of Canada's media industry that has been in financial freefall for a decade. 2019's federal budget disclosed new details about the distribution of $595 million that has been earmarked in the fall economic statement for promoting Canadian journalism. Qualifying criteria would see money directed at journalistic organizations primarily involved in the production of original news, with an emphasis placed on coverage of democratic institutions and processes. The budget also revealed an independent panel of experts from the Canadian journalism sector would be created to help figure out which news will be eligible to receive money or tax credits over a 5-year period. You can see right there from the government's economic update using a direct phrase from the PPF report. The opposition Conservatives have dismissed the measures, accusing the Liberals of buying off the media in advance of the October election at taxpayer expense. The independent panel is key to ensuring the government itself isn't perceived to have a hand in deciding who gets money and who doesn't, says Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez. We must protect journalistic independence, and that's why an independent experts panel will define eligibility to these new investments. We are going to the root of the problem and creating concrete measures to support Canadian newspapers, big and small. But that specificity that the government means to support newspapers in particular is what draws criticism. The minister notes, Canadian written press has taken the biggest hit as they've lost half their jobs since 2010. Now, in the budget, there are proposed refundable tax credits to help media organizations cover up to a quarter of their labor costs. But the credits would only be made available to what are deemed qualified Canadian journalism organizations and would exclude entities carrying on a broadcasting undertaking. The Canadian Association of Broadcasters, surprise, surprise, calls that unfair. If the government is truly committed to recognizing the vital role media plays in helping citizens make informed decisions, it must find a way to include radio and television news outlets in this tax credit regime. Magazine publishers also would not qualify for tax credits if they already receive aid through the Canadian Periodical Fund. Now, the statement that broadcast must be included came from the Canadian Association of Broadcasters chair, Lenore Gibson, a lawyer for Bell Media. Media union CWA Canada welcomed the budget measures, but worried that the rules could allow a traditional media giant, such as Postmedia Network Incorporated, to benefit without necessarily helping journalism. CWA Canada President Martin O'Hanlon said, "We need to know there will be rules to ensure that a company like Postmedia can't simply take millions of dollars in labor tax credits and pass that on to the debt holders who control it, or to pay huge executive salaries or bonuses." Point well taken, Martin. Now, you remember, as I said, this is from March of this year, so still very early in what this is going to look like. A qualified organization would have to be set up as a corporation, partnership, or trust. If it is a public corporation, it must be listed on a Canadian stock exchange and not be controlled by non-Canadian citizens. If it's a private corporation, it must be at least 75% Canadian owned. Regardless of that, a spokeswoman for Postmedia said the guidelines unveiled by the Trudeau government so far indicate the company would qualify for the labor tax credits, but added that it's too soon to say for certain. News Media Canada, which represents 800 publications throughout Canada, also said it was unclear whether the country's biggest media firms would qualify for the tax credits. A spokesman, however, said some community newspapers had already indicated they planned to hire more journalists based on details in Tuesday's budget. Well, that Tuesday. April Lindgren, who operates Ryerson University's local news research project, questioned whether the measures will result in any more journalists being hired to cover local news. I don't think it's going to spark a whole bunch of new hires in journalists. Regardless, under the parameters set out in the budget, most of the aid money would be funneled to struggling mainstream players, said Chris Waddell, a professor at Carleton University's School of Journalism, who questions the logic behind the move. We're in a situation where, in fact, government is subsidizing the least likely people to succeed in the current format. My question is why? To what end? Well, Mr. Waddell should read The Shattered Mirror. The bulk of the journalism funding proposed in the budget, $360 million over 5 years, is attached to the labor tax credits. Once the budget is approved, the credits would apply retroactively to the beginning of 2019 and cover 25% of the costs of journalists working a minimum of 26 hours per week for 40 consecutive weeks. Qualifying organizations would also be required to employ at least 2 journalists who spend at least 3/4 of their time engaging in the production of news content, including by researching, collecting information, verifying facts, photographing, writing, editing, designing, and otherwise preparing content. And content would be defined as matters of general interest and reports of current events, including coverage of democratic institutions and processes. Ding, 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 there's the exact words again. Budget also includes tax credits of 15% on subscriptions to digital news websites, allowing Canadians to claim up to $500 worth of subscriptions per year to qualify for a maximum $75 tax credit. But that credit won't be available until 2020. Such a tax credit is doomed because there is so much free content online, and the public cannot differentiate between quality and commodity news, said Mr. Waddell. People are not refusing to buy online subscriptions because they're $15 a month rather than $13 a month. They're refusing to buy because they see the alternative is $0 a month. That was in March. Now we go all the way to May, where the current hubbub has been started. Again, not accurate, worth a shit, but, you know, it gets clicks, and it's definitely part of System B, as we discussed earlier. It's from My Politics, May 22nd. So, you know, just a couple weeks ago. Marco Vigliari, Liberals task news associations with naming panel on eligibility for journalism support. Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez has asked 8 news and journalist associations to select candidates for a panel to determine what media organizations are eligible for new federal tax incentives. The expert panel, expected to be appointed in mid-June, has been struck to ensure any recommendations on eligibility for the federal government's $595 million support package for the news media are efficient, transparent, and fair. The minister's office says, our government is committed to ensuring that Canadians everywhere continue to have access to accurate, diverse, and relevant news. In order for that to happen, we have to continue to have an active, professional, reliable, and independent press. The groups tapped by Ottawa to offer recommendations for the panel include News Media Canada, the Association de la Presse Francophone, the Quebec Community Newspaper Association, the National Ethnic Press and Media Council of Canada, the Canadian Association of Journalists, the Fédération Professionnelle des Journalistes du Québec, Unifor, and the Fédération Nationale des Communications. Rodriguez's office said the associations were selected because they represent the majority of Canadian news media publishers and journalists and can consider the views of third parties and stakeholders. Critics have raised concerns about having the federal government determine what news organizations are eligible to receive the tax incentives. It's expected that this panel will offer its recommendations to the minister in July. And of course, when that came out, well, cue the System B side of the process. May 24th, the postmillennial.com. Jason Unraw. Canadian Association of Journalists threatens to quit Trudeau's $600 million media bailout panel. Well, that right there is a little misleading. An association representing more than 700 Canadian journalists is threatening to pull out of a federal panel that will decide which media outlets qualify for $600 million in tax breaks. No, that's not what this panel is doing. If you read the government information, that would be clear. System B. Canadian Association of Journalists President Karen Pugliese told the Post-Millennial that any secrecy over determining winners and losers in Ottawa's media bailout is a deal breaker. This has to be a transparent process. Journalists are not going to live with something that's not completely open. Okay. Now, how does that qualify with the claim that this panel will decide which outlets qualify for $600 million? It doesn't. Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez announced the 8 groups invited to join the panel tasked with determining what constitutes a qualified Canadian journalism organization. Organizations that make the cut would then be eligible for up to $13,750 in annual tax breaks for individual editorial staff. Again, that is not accurate. System B. Now we get back to what Karen Pugliese actually said. We might participate, we might not. This is a highly controversial for journalists. There are journalists who think the government shouldn't be doing this. There are journalists who are okay with it. Now, her day job is Director of Current Affairs and News for APTN, Aboriginal People's Television Network. And there are journalists doing startups who are worried about the impact on their business if the legacy media is supported and they're left out. So, here's proof right here of System B hopping on something to help System A, but in the moment, it certainly helps System B. May 26th, CTV, Rachel Aiello. Minister vows transparency over $600 million media fund and defends the inclusion of Unifor. The minister responsible for overseeing the rollout of nearly $600 million in subsidies to select media outlets is vowing that the decision-making process for who will be getting this funding will be transparent. The whole process will be public, said Canadian Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez in an interview with Evan Solomon. This comment was made as he sought to defend what has become a controversial decision to include Unifor, the largest private sector union in Canada, on the panel to pick representatives who will give advice on who should be eligible for the federal dollars. Over the last few years, the Liberals have begun signaling their intent to intervene to help save or support the news industry, which has seen hundreds of operations shuttered and thousands of jobs lost in the last decade. Rodriguez announced this week that he is asking 8 associations that represent journalists in Canada to offer up a candidate each to work on the independent panel tasked with making recommendations on who should be eligible. We're a long way from handing over any money yet. These groups include journalism associations and advocacy groups that represent reporters across Canada, including French language and ethnic press organizations, and Unifor. The union, which does represent 11,900 people in the media sector, has billed itself as the resistance to Andrew Scheer and his worst nightmare. The organization as a whole represents workers in several other industries as well, including auto sector, retail, manufacturing, education, and hospitality. Asked why Unifor was included and whether he had any concerns that the anti-conservative messaging will undermine or erodes people trust in the media and journalists, Rodriguez denied it, saying the message is largely being pushed by Scheer. And he also said the panel is arm's length. We wanted to make sure the panel was constituted with people from all the spheres from the news world. So you have owners, you have unions representing journalists, and you have minority groups. It had to be balanced, represent the regions, represent the official languages, and I think we reached a good balance. Are we saying that we don't want the workers represented? In a statement posted to its Facebook page about the controversy, Unifor called it an intentional mischaracterization of a process. Asked if decisions from the panel will be made public, Rodriguez said absolutely, and that all of its recommendations will be public as well. We'll listen to them, we'll listen to what they say, and we'll definitely make it public. It's really important that we do so, and we will. See, again, that reflects that the Liberal government read the shattered mirror that said Canadians are very leery about any government funding going to legacy media. Now, as far as that Unifor statement, that came out on May 24th. And this is it. The Conservative Party of Canada's intentional mischaracterization of a process designed to support Canada's struggling news industry is an affront to professional journalism and democracy. Andrew Scheer, like Donald Trump, is positioning himself to campaign in a national election by fueling public distrust in the media, even if that means resorting to misstatements and half-truths. In a Twitter message posted earlier this week, the rookie Conservative Party leader circulated a satirical photo of elected Unifor officials taken in 2018, spoofing a controversial Maclean's magazine cover referring to Scheer, Doug Ford, and other conservatives as the resistance. In that message, Scheer incorrectly suggested that Unifor officials have been appointed to help decide how new federal funds to support struggling news organizations will be distributed. Scheer would have Canadians think that Unifor is somehow responsible for deciding how federal funds will be allocated, which is patently and unequivocally false. Again, Scheer using System B regarding the condition of System A. The federal government has announced it will convene an independent panel of technical experts, including journalists. This panel is responsible for defining the terms of quality and professional journalism, a task best left to professionals in the field and not politicians. Unifor, along with a balance of 7 other organizations, including journalist associations, worker organizations, and media corporations, has been asked to recommend an expert who can assist in these preliminary technical discussions. This panel has until the end of July to provide its definitional terms, and then will disband. The federal government will then convene a completely separate panel responsible for allocating funds to eligible news organizations. Unifor will have no role in this panel. There is a lot at stake as we work to protect and preserve our news industry in Canada. And after years of discussion, we finally have a path forward. Scheer's determination to impugn the integrity of Canadian journalists and news organizations and attack unions defending media workers undermines the importance of a preface of a free press. By inflaming the situation through his own brand of fake news, Andrew Scheer is putting the very principles of truth and democracy at risk. Well, Unifor is telling the truth, as opposed to other segments of what can now be accurately called System B. But notice the change of a political party and a political brand willing to use System B to attack System A. Who would have ever thought that, even a decade ago? Now, what this panel is being asked to do relates directly to some final thoughts looking forward from the Shattered Mirror. I'm not going to go into them too deep. I'm just going to give you what they are, and we'll go from there. Defining civic function journalism. That is obviously something that this advisory panel is being asked to do. Section 19 and the Internet. Of course, this relates to the Income Tax Act, and it was extended to broadcasting in the 70s. Now, this is about what is taxable and what isn't as far as advertising goes that supports media. Potential pitfalls for foundations. What to do when newspapers close. Again, the Shattered Mirror does not think that print can be rescued. The downside of tax credits. Thinking hard about the problem of fake news. The supply side and the demand side. The Shattered Mirror recommends taking a look at competition policy and the marketplace of ideas. They are certainly not the first to bring up that a revisit of the Competition Act in Canada is overdue. I was going to speak on Post Media, trying to play both sides of the coin already by applying to be a contractor to the Alberta government quote-unquote war room, otherwise known as propaganda room. But I'm going to hold off on that. The only thing that really matters about that is because of Post Media applying to contract to the Government of Alberta propaganda room, NDP ethics critic Charlie Angus has already petitioned Minister of Finance Bill Morneau that Post Media would be excluded from whatever requirements and criteria these two panels are going to come up with. Of course, Post Media insists, oh, no, that's our advertising arm. That's not our news arm. There's a difference? Jesus Christ. We'll see what happens. Everything that research told the government is you have to tread very lightly with the subject of public money to media. And I think the biggest thing from Shattered Mirror is Canadians expect their traditional media to be there. They have affection for them. They just simply don't want to pay for it. That's a new problem as well. It's going to be interesting what happens going forward, but I thought it was worth getting the background out there that nobody else has done, that I'm aware of, besides, the people in the very small circles. But it's time people had an idea of what the reality of the situation is and what it means to Canadians. I don't envy the federal government. We'll see what happens. I hope that gave some enlightenment to what's happening. Like I said, shatteredmirror.ca, so you can get the Public Policy Forum download for the Shattered Mirror. That's it for tonight. I can say that possibly the next show will be still related in the same vein. It will be about the digital charter. And again, this seems to be exploding into view suddenly. Where did all this come from? That's hardly the whole story. I had to laugh myself when there was an announcement of a signed digital charter. Well, I was at RightsCon 2018 in Toronto in May of 2018. And there was a digital charter of rights there that was endorsed from organizations and people all over the world more than a year ago. So yeah, way to go there, Justin. Get with the program. We'll see what else. Of course, I intend to return some focus to the Indigenous and Aboriginal side of things, especially the release of the final report from the MMIWG inquiry. We'll see. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening to The View Up Here. We'll see you next time. Good night.